Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Reynolds and I'll be your professor this semester for English 6610, Fundamentals of Linguistics. For this first week, I'm going to introduce some major ideas that will guide the way we think about language for this course. It's a little bit different if you've never had a linguistics course before. Linguistics is simply the study of the structure of human language. And so we want to think about some big issues before we get down into the analysis of actual language structures. For each week, make sure you're doing the reading. I encourage you to do all the exercises in each chapter as you're working. And then as I move into those chapters to create lectures, I'll be able to refer to those exercises so that you and I can share the same examples. It will help you understand any problems you had with those exercises and hopefully clarify the topics in the book. For now, I'm going to turn off my camera so you can focus on the slides. Welcome to the class. So chapter 1 is really just kind of an overview of these issues, 4 big issues we're going to talk about. Those 4 key concepts for thinking about language as a linguist are specialization, creativity, linguistic competence, and grammar. So what do we mean when we talk about specialization for language? Well, humans are specialized for language in ways that differentiate us from other animals who can communicate but do not have language. So it's very important to note that humans are the only animals that have language. Language is not communication. Language can be used. It's a tool for communication. But we oftentimes communicate without language, right? We can wave at somebody to say hi. Just waving is not a language. It's a signal. We can smile to suggest certain things. We can wink to suggest certain things. We might call them body language, but it's not an actual language, and we'll talk about why as we move through the course. That does not mean that there aren't languages that are made up of signs. So it's important to note, for example, that American Sign Language is a language, even though it is not verbalized. So while most of the languages we'll be talking about this semester are primarily expressed verbally, and we'll talk a little bit about grammar and writing at the end of the course, it is possible to have other forms of writing because of the ways in which humans are specialized for language, okay? So we are specialized because we can produce language, linguistic production. That is, we can push air from our lungs through our larynx and our vocal cords and our tongue and our mouth and our teeth and our lips and our nasal cavities can all be used in different ways to create different sounds, okay? We can produce those sounds. For people who are mute, who cannot produce those sounds, they can still produce complex language with gestures, with their hands, right? Linguistic perception, that is the ability to receive that language, right? And that has to do with our ability to hear certain sounds, certain tones. There are languages that are highly dependent on tonality, for example. Mandarin is one of those. Once again, sometimes perception is different in different humans, right? But somebody who is deaf, for example, might perceive spoken language by reading lips, okay? There are different ways to perceive language. And of course, in a typical healthy human body, we are able to produce verbal language and hear verbal language. The final way, and probably the most important, I would say, is our mental capability. Our brains, our human brains, allow us to compile linguistic knowledge, some of which it is theorized is already structured in your brain at birth, which allows us to create and understand language, right? So understanding is different than perceiving, right? Perceiving, we hear it, for example. Understanding is actually knowing what it means. And language, if you think about it, requires quite a bit of interpretation. A lot of what we say with our words is different or more nuanced than the particular words we are using. Think, for example, again, of the issue of hi. There are different ways to say that. If I say hi, I might be really excited to see you. Say hi, right? Maybe I'm not as excited to see you, right? But if we see that word written hi on the page, it doesn't have any nuance. But speech in use has nuance, and linguists are particularly interested in speech as real people produce it. Creativity is an important concept. We don't memorize language, we create it. So while it's true that we can memorize things like vocabulary words, Malcolm X, for example, was famous for reading the dictionary to build his vocabulary. We don't memorize our language faculties. We don't memorize every sentence we use before we use it or as we use it. And I certainly can't remember all the sentences I've just said to you over the past few minutes. Human language is therefore creative. It allows us to use, to produce, to perceive, and understand new words and sentences as needed. Think, for example, before the advent of the car, there was no word for car because there was no need for that, right? So we had an automobile, something that could move by itself automatically, right, without a horse pulling it or a person pulling it, right? It's an automobile. So we, as humans, have this faculty in our brains that allows us to create new words and new expressions as we need them. We've seen an explosion of this recently with the advent of text talk and other internet-based speech. It is important to note, however, that there are limitations to what's acceptable to native speakers of a language. And linguists are very interested in identifying and understanding those limitations. There are certain combinations of letters that are not acceptable in English. There are certain combinations of words that are not acceptable in English, and we'll be talking a lot about that as we move forward in the course. Linguistic competence is another big idea. Linguistic competence is that mental capacity that we have as native speakers of a language that allows us to use our native languages. So linguistic competence is the subconscious knowledge that allows native speakers of a language to use, that is, produce, perceive, and understand an infinite number of utterances, both familiar and novel. In other words, we have the mental faculty that allows us to not only use things we've already heard before, but to actually create new sentences and new expressions continuously and without limitations as far as the number of possibilities. But certainly, as I mentioned before, there are limitations as to what's acceptable to other native speakers. It's also interesting to think about the fact that this is subconscious. That is, this is something that we have within our brains that is very difficult or perhaps impossible at this point for us to access and analyze within our brains. Instead, we have to analyze the production of that through speech or through writing. What do we know about that? Well, people make mistakes, right? So while all native speakers have this unconscious knowledge of their language, we often make mistakes when we talk. Sometimes it's an error of production, right? We mean to say something and something else comes out. Sometimes it's an error of perception, right? We think we hear something that somebody said, but we didn't hear what they said. And sometimes it's an issue of understanding. Have you ever read a poem and felt frustrated because you couldn't understand what the poet was trying to convey? So think about these issues, right? So in other words, actual language use does not always reflect our linguistic competence, right? So we know a lot more about language than sometimes our production and our use of language conveys. And the challenge as a linguist is that we only have the production to analyze. We can't analyze inside your brain yet. So think about linguistic competence as a linguist. So how do we get to that? How do we analyze the use of speech? Well, linguists traditionally divide this subconscious knowledge into the following fields of study, which we will work through in the first 8, 9 weeks of this course, okay? So we're going to start with phonetics. Phonetics is very simply the study of the sounds found in a language, including articulation, right? How we create those sounds, and the perception, how we understand those sounds. If you think about phonetics only as an English phenomenon, you're already familiar as a native speaker with all the sounds that are possible in the English language. However, you've likely heard other languages produce sounds that we do not use in English. Those sounds are also studied in phonetics by linguists. And there are symbols for those sounds, just like there are symbols for all the sounds that are possible in English. We'll work on that when we get to phonetics, which is chapter 2. So we're gonna start on that immediately this week. Phonology, the study of how speech sounds pattern in language. So we're gonna talk a lot about patterns as we talk about the ways in which languages are built, and that is certain speech sounds we will see go together in certain languages, and certain speech sounds do not work together, okay? Morphology, the study of word structure and word formation, right? How can we analyze the words in a particular language to understand how words are built? Syntax, the study of sentence structure. How are sentences constructed in a particular language? And finally, semantics. How do we understand what is the meaning, what is the value of our expressions? Okay, so that's what we're going to work on for the beginning of this course. Once we get through these areas, which are kind of the traditional areas of linguistics, that for those foundations you need to be able to do linguistic work in the future, we will then consider some of the other applications and other interests of research of many linguists right across the world right now, okay? Including first language acquisition, right? How do we actually learn our first language? Second language acquisition, right? When we go into another culture, how do we learn that language? It's very interesting, for example, for people who, I imagine some of you want to be teachers to speakers of other languages. And so having that kind of knowledge of the background and that field could be helpful to you. So we'll look at some of those issues towards the end of the semester. Grammar is a central idea for linguists, and grammar for a linguist refers to all the elements of our linguistic competence. In other words, the system of rules and elements needed to form and interpret the sentences of a language. And I want you to remember a few things, and that is that all languages have a grammar. We call that generality. Right? So it's important to note that while we may have learned in the past that certain languages were preferable to others, or that certain languages died because they weren't as sophisticated as other languages, please know that all languages are complex and all languages have a grammar. All languages will allow the native speaker to develop new words and phrases and sentences as needed to describe the world around them. And so that points to parity. Parity is just the idea that all grammars are equal. A lot of times in the past we've had preference given in our own culture, or perhaps by other cultures, that say one language is preferable to the other for these reasons. But for a linguist, all grammars are equal. All grammars are interesting, and all grammars are worth study. Universality is the recognition that grammars are alike in basic ways. For example, all grammars have nouns and verbs. In other words, they all have words that describe things, and they all have words used to convey action, right? All grammars have sentences. Right? There are lots of basic ways in which grammars are alike. Grammars are often very different as well, okay? Mutability. Grammars change over time. You ever hear anybody say, or do you ever think, people just, don't use grammar as well as they used to? That's somewhat problematic, because for a linguist, what we recognize is that language is constantly evolving to meet the needs of its users in particular contexts. So we're always going to have new words and new phrases, always. always going to have new possible sentences. If we didn't have that, we would all still be speaking ancient languages. We don't speak ancient languages now, not because those languages weren't useful in their time, but because those languages have changed over time and become other languages. Okay? And then finally, one of the frustrating things for linguists, but something we need to acknowledge, is the inaccessibility of grammar. That is, while we can look at the production of grammar and try to analyze it, right, in speech, grammatical knowledge is subconscious. It is something that exists within the black box of the brain that we are still trying to understand from many different fields, many different perspectives, okay? One other idea about grammar that we want to discuss that I've kind of hinted at already is that what linguists do, we call descriptive grammar. So you see that little arrow. This is what we're working on, right? So the object of descriptive grammar is to give an objective description without judgment, right? Objective of the knowledge that native speakers of a language share. In other words, how do people actually use language? Okay? What can we figure out about how those sounds work, how those words work, how those sentences work, how they make meaning, right, as native speakers? Prescriptive grammar, if you're a teacher or you're going to be a teacher, this may be what you focused on as a student as well in the past, is where you're learning the socially accepted rules within a language. And sometimes those rules are very hard and fast. For example, a declarative sentence must end with a period. And sometimes they're flexible depending on the situation, right? Don't use slang words in an essay, for example. Okay? That's prescriptive. We are not interested as linguists with prescriptive grammar. Those are artificial rules created by social situations, a lot of times to do with status and power, right? To say that the ways in which particular groups of native speakers use language is preferable to others, okay? We are not interested in that in this class. So be aware the difference between descriptive grammar, so when we talk about grammar in this class as the structure, right, of language and the elements you need to produce language. When I say grammar, then I'm not talking about prescriptive grammar. This is not right or wrong. This is what is, without judgment, okay? So in conclusion, linguistics is the study of the structures of human language. Linguists attempt to describe the subconscious knowledge that the native speakers of the language share, which allows them to speak, perceive, and understand their language. While the primary focus of our discussion is English, which makes sense because we're English native speakers, the principles and theories of linguistics apply to other human languages as well. So as always, if you have questions, shoot me an email. I'm around. Thanks a lot.